are. This is a story for all ages. It's called Put Off Your Shoes, and it comes from a really, really famous story in the Bible from Exodus chapter 3. Now, I'm going to ask you all to do something unusual this morning. Put off your shoes. Now, if you're feeling really adventurous, you could take off your socks as well, although I don't know if you have socks on yet because it's a little early in the year for that. But here I come, my shoes off. And sit quietly for a minute and feel your feet without shoes. Wiggle your toes. Turn your ankle. Can you feel the air of the room on your foot? Yeah, it's funny to feel that in church, isn't it? Move your feet a little bit on the floor and imagine what it would feel like to walk or move your feet on sand, which you do know that feeling from the beach, but we're going to feel like we're on the same desert sand that Moses walked thousands of years ago. Because I want you to feel the same feeling that every human being who has ever walked on the earth has felt from their feet, just like you feel on your feet when you put it on the ground, and the energy of your life on the surface where you stand or where you have your little paw down there, your little foot. Just like every person who has ever walked, and of course, we didn't always have shoes, but this is a story from a long time ago when people they walked around in sandals. And so I want you to leave your feet uncovered while I tell this story. Well, Moses was raised as a grandson of the Pharaoh, who was like the king of the Egyptians, but he still thought of himself as a Hebrew, who were the slaves of the Egyptians. Once, he saw an Egyptian master beating a Hebrew slave, and he got really upset and tried to stop the Egyptian. And in the struggle, Moses killed the Egyptian. This made the Pharaoh very angry, and Moses had to go into hiding. While he was in hiding, he got married and started a family. And while he was out one day tending his father-in-law's sheep, he saw a bush that was burning. But it wasn't burning down. So he went closer to look at it up on the side of a mountain. And as Moses came closer, he heard a voice calling out to him, "Moses, Moses." I can't really sound like Charlton Heston the way I want to. And Moses answered, "I am here." And he heard the voice say, "Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet. Take off your shoes, for you are standing on holy ground." So Moses kicked off his sandals. And he heard the voice say, "I am the God of your fathers, of the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob." And Moses covered his face because he was in the presence of God and he was afraid to look. God told Moses that the suffering of the Hebrew people had not gone unnoticed, that he had heard their cries, and he was going to deliver them from the Egyptians and to bring them to a land flowing with milk and honey. So God was going to send him, Moses, to free the Hebrew people from Egypt. And Moses said, "Oh, no way, not me. I am not the guy you want. Oh, I'm nobody. What am I going to say if my people ask me, what gives you the authority to lead this movement? What shall I say?" And God said to Moses, "Tell them that I am who I am has sent you. The God of your fathers and your mothers, the God of Abraham and Sarah, the God of Isaac and Rebekah, the God of Jacob and Rachel has sent me to you." This story should sound familiar to those of you who did the Passover story in concert last year. Moses said, "No, the people aren't going to believe me." And God said, "Look, I'm going to give you a couple of really impressive moves to show the people." He said, "Take the staff you're holding," right? Shepherds have a staff like this. They have like a stick. He said, "Throw it on the ground." And Moses did. He took a stick and he threw it and it turned into a snake. It did. I'm so glad you know these stories. These are so important. And Moses drew back from it and the snake went. So God told him, grab the snake by the tail, and Moses did, and boom, it turned back into a stick. And then God told Moses, put your hand inside of your robe. Moses did it. Okay, put it in there. And when he took his hand out, it was covered with icky, leprous sores. And he went, ooh! And God said, put your hand back inside your cloak. And Moses did. And he took it out again, and his hand was just fine. God said to Moses, if they don't believe you, you got to show them these moves that I gave you. All right? And this should work. But Moses still protested. He said, I stutter. I stammer. I can't get the words out. And God said to him, I will take care of that for you. I will give you smooth speech. And Moses said, I really, really, please, I don't want to do this. And at this point, God started getting irritated. He was like, okay, listen, I will send your brother Aaron as well to speak for you, but you are still my guy. You are still my guy, and you have to go. And Moses and his family then went to Egypt. 4 times he had tried to get out of going, but he believed that it was God who was calling him. And so in the end, he went. And you know what happens next in this story, but there's a lot to think about there, and especially what happens when we stand on holy ground. Have a wonderful time learning and sharing time together in Sunday school. We'll see you at coffee hour. So you're looking at your order of service maybe and thinking, who is the Reverend Parisa Parsa and where is she? She is home sick. I'm afraid, and I am pinch hitting for her. And she wrote this beautiful sermon and this beautiful service. And so I thought, well, maybe I'll just read her sermon. But sometimes that just doesn't feel quite right, you know? So I thought, well, maybe I will read her sermon and the Bible passage that she was thinking about when she crafted hers. And I'll do like a little Lectio Divina. Have you ever heard that term, Lectio Divina? Okay, what it just means, it's a certain way of reading Scripture. Scripture could be the Bible, or it could be something that is a sacred reading for you, or that feels really spiritually important to you. And you really kind of enter into the text. You just read little bits at a time and put yourself in the place of the person who's writing. And so you really, every word starts to matter and every phrase. And the idea isn't to read like a whole bunch, but you're just reading a little nugget of a passage and studying it deeply. So I'm going to do a little bit of that, reflecting with you on Exodus 3, which is the story I just shared with the children. So that's what I'm going to do. And I beg your forbearance. It's a kind of an experiment. So Moses is there out and in the desert shepherding, and he's minding his own business, and he gets called out by God. And the first thing that the voice of God says is, put off your shoes, or, take off your shoes. You're standing on holy ground. So right away, we're in sacred space. And Moses says, as you would, who are you? And so God gives Moses all his credentials, right? He goes, I'm the God of your father. I'm the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac. He gives him the whole genealogy, the God of Jacob. And Moses covers his face, this really just intuitive gesture of being in the presence of something overwhelming. And God says, when asked to give God's own name, God says, I am that I am. The great I am is speaking to Moses. But I want you to know that translated appropriately, there is a sense of becoming to the verb. I am becoming what I am becoming is actually another way to say that the I am names itself. And I want to quote Parsa here. She writes, but here where God is really pressed to name God's own identity, God is the core of being itself, a being that Moses might know through those ancestors described, but who is much larger than a particular lineage. This is God as a source of all that has been and all that is to be, not a person, but a verb. The very act of becoming. And so this being, this verb, this process says to Moses, I'm going to lead your people, the Hebrews, out of Egypt, out of oppression, to a land flowing with milk and honey. But you're the one who needs to negotiate with Pharaoh. And as I said in the story, Moses responds, oh, no, not me. You know this. And so God gives him all these impressive magical things to do. You turn the staff into a snake. All those things described in the story. You bring your hand out of your cloak and it's going to be covered with leprous sores and then it's going to be healed. And even with all of those tricks up his sleeve, Moses says, please send someone else. So I want to stop right there in our Lectio Divina. I want to stop right there before we get to the end of the story, which is a happy ending. If you're a Hebrew, it's a happy ending. If you're an Egyptian, it isn't so happy. This is actually the liberation narrative for Western culture. But I want to stop in two places where Moses is instructed to take off his sandals first. So going right back to that first encounter and meditate with you about two things that seem really deep about that moment in the story. We've been exploring the concept of sacred space this month here. And what we have in this moment between God and Moses is the idea that sacred space will stop you in your tracks. You see what happens here? Moses is just moseying along. I actually don't know if that's where the word moseying comes from, But he gets stopped. And he gets told to do something right where he is. Take off your shoes. What does that signify? What does that signify? We actually need to take that apart for a moment. First of all, when do you get asked to remove your shoes? When you're at the threshold of some dwelling place and you're being polite, right? Some cultures have that, not so much ours, but some of your friends may do this. So this is a cultural practice about accepting and offering hospitality. It's showing respect for someone else's space that has been swept and made ready for your arrival. So this is like God saying to Moses, you're entering my space. This is my threshold. This is a threshold. And so the first act that Moses is asked to do to respect this space that God has set there has brought him to a sense of, I guess, what we would call humility or acquiescence, which is a really important spiritual thing when we accommodate the other, when we show our sense of respect rather than heroism in the sacred space. This is what I'm thinking about. Like, you know how people have those bumper stickers on their cars that say, this car climbed Mount Washington? And that's a sacred space for a lot of people, the mountains. Well, with this sense of humility and respect that Moses is being asked to show on God's sacred space, if you were going to translate that to that bumper sticker, you would rephrase it as Mount Washington, in its majesty and holiness, allowed us to ascend it. You see what I mean? There's a different orientation, when you are going to take off your shoes and enter the holy ground instead of, here I come, heroic, consumeristic, conquering, boom, I'm going to claim it. To remove our sandals on holy ground is to really be there too, to really feel that ground, to experience it. Don't miss this, is what God is saying. This ground is alive in me, in the great I am. And you see this again with the inanimate staff that Moses is carrying. Boom, turning into a snake. Becomes an animate thing when it strikes the ground. It becomes alive. Another hint that this is holy ground. Things that are inanimate become active, alive, exciting. So that's a really wonderful riff on the idea of God as ground of being, which is a phrase that you may have heard. So I would like you to imagine yourself in spaces in your own life where you get stopped short and feel interrupted, taken off guard, and brought to this feeling of being on a threshold of reverence and respect that might be a little awkward and unusual for you. A place where you are not in charge and not in control, where there may be a spiritual energy at work making something happen. And you feel pulled into it. And like Moses, you would maybe sort of like to avoid being responsible for responding to that demand, let alone leading it. Some things examples I can think about in my own life are when I go into a funeral home in the presence of death, or even a hospital. There is that sense of, yes, my professional obligations, my calling calls me to those places, but there is that threshold where you kind of stop and you're on holy ground and it's very alive and intense. There's a presence there that is very deep and demanding. Or, when I just stop and talk to a neighbor and instead of getting the regular, hi, how are you, I get drawn into a very intense and maybe tragic story about what's going on with their lives. This can happen to us here in church. We feel like we've been stopped. Whoa. Something really deep is happening. God is present here. And take off your shoes. You stay put and feel this electric thing happening. It's going to take you out of your way, this holy ground, this presence, even though you are staying put, way out of your way. So the idea I want to communicate here is that it's often when we don't go looking for it, we may wind up going to a beautiful space where we're really looking to experience the holy, and nothing really happens there. It's like, that was pretty, that was nice, the Grand Canyon or wherever you went. Niagara Falls, oh, that's pretty, I'm going to take a selfie, but I didn't really feel the holy presence there. It's something that we often will just demand, we will often stumble on that will demand something of us, and it will feel a little bit dangerous. So that's what I get from this story. And the second most important detail that stands out for me this time of reading Exodus 3 is that Moses gets this job from God that's going to require him to go to the Pharaoh and become the main leader in the liberation of his own people. And this I was reading Exodus 3 and I was like, oh, you know what I just realized? Moses has to liberate his own people. Okay, bing. A lot of times when we hear the word liberation, what do you think? You think about the oppressed people out there, right? We have to liberate them. It feels really good to be a savior. All those broken and hurting places in the world, and even in our own immediate community. For this congregation, that desire to liberate is located in the city of Lynn, where our congregation has its history, and it's where our wealth comes from. We just had a social justice ministry team retreat last weekend, and we talked a lot about that, how we feel this sense of necessity to minister in the city of Lynn. This church wants to liberate people from poverty, neglect, oppression by employers, and systems of racism and homophobia, prejudice, and that is a holy instinct. It comes from love and righteousness and concern and solidarity. But this story about Moses here is making me think about the importance of understanding that we also need to liberate our own people. Okay, this community in our case, this little one, our own church. I don't have anything really more insightful to say about that because it's kind of its own sermon. But it's really important to point that out. When we are saving the world, or hoping to, in our minds, it's important to remember that we ourselves need a lot of liberating. So what happens when you leave the divine or God out of the liberation equation is that we can get the idea that it's humans who are gods, and that never works. We are all players in the work of liberation. We liberate each other from chains that bind. So that's just a little asterisk, a little note for all of our work and our dreams for social change, okay? That's just, note that. And finally, as we stand on this holy ground with Moses and feel a little bit of how that feels, how that demands and electrifies us as individuals, as a community, please let's not miss this crucial part of the story, which is that Moses feels entirely incapable of the demands placed on him by God. He says, I can't do this. I am not your guy. I'm slow of speech. I don't have the talent. I'm not going to do this. I'm not the one. But in the end, if you notice, he really has to be pushed onto the stage by God as an overbearing stage mother. Get out there and sing. Sing out, Louise. And this happens like my friend Jane from Maine, who this morning is at the People's Climate March in New York City. She's not a young, strong-bodied person. She gets around slowly, in fact, and has some mobility issues. But I think she feels the earth is holy ground, and that demands something of her. So she got on a bus yesterday morning at 3:30 a.m. to put shoes on the ground with tens of thousands, hopefully hundreds of thousands of other people to witness for the planet and environmental change. And I said to her, be careful. And I was thinking, just be careful because of the long walk. And she, as I said, she gets around slowly. And she said, don't worry, I'm wearing my ID under my neck, under my clothing, in case the poop hits the fan. So that, I realized, my God, she thinks she might actually, need to be identified. She's really taking a major risk here. She's a March virgin, as she puts it. She's never done this before. And like Moses, would far rather someone else be called to do this work. But Jane today is my living reminder this weekend that sacred spaces are not those that make us feel powerful and able necessarily. They may be, as one such space was for Moses, places that remind us and bring us to great awareness of our vulnerability and limitation. But here's some good news, if you were looking for some. Remember the translation of the great I am, which is the way God names God's own self, I am. Remember what I said about that more accurate translation? Being something like, I will be what I will be, or I am becoming what I am becoming. Haya asher eye. What does that tell you? It tells me that this is all an evolutionary process for all of creation. We are being transformed when we encounter sacred spaces and consent to the demands placed upon us in those spaces. And God's own self, the energy of creation, its own self, is also changing, evolving as a force. God is becoming what God is becoming. None of this is done and over and decided. All of creation is becoming. It is happening. It is unfolding. It will be. So thanks be for our place in this. And thank you for sharing this Lectio Divina with me.